Hey, welcome back to Iconic Worx Media, where legends are forged and monsters are never forgotten. Survival Rebirth, the Tribal World. Arc 2, the Tools of Evolution. Chapter 13, The Bend in the Wood. The frost bit into Kael's small, calloused feet as he stepped onto the obsidian-flecked soil of the Stoneclaw Plateau. It was early dawn, a time when the world was painted in shades of bruised purple and charcoal gray. For Elias, the man whose soul now inhabited this 12-year-old body, the cold was an old enemy. But in this life, it felt more intimate, a constant predator nipping at the heels of the tribe. Kael looked toward the center of the village, where a thin plume of smoke rose from Gore's hut. The chieftain's health was a ticking clock. Every wet, rattling cough that echoed through the camp was a reminder that the Stoneclaw's current stability was a fragile thing. Kael turned his attention to Bruga, who was already training. The mountain of a man was practicing with his heavy, stone-tipped spear. With a grunt that seemed to come from his very marrow, Bruga launched the weapon. It whistled through the air, striking a bundle of packed grass with a dull thud. 40 paces, Bruga muttered, wiping sweat from his brow despite the freezing air. He looked over at Kael, his lip curling in a familiar mixture of disdain and curiosity. "You still staring at the trees, little shadow? Spears feed the belly. Your sticks and strings are for children." Kael didn't flinch. His analytical mind, sharpened by decades of modern survivalism and the precision of a master hunter, was busy calculating the arc of the spear. 40 paces is a death sentence if the iron bone can strike from 60, Kael said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Malakor's men don't just have spears, Bruga. They have numbers. We need distance. We need a lever that gravity doesn't own so easily." Bruga snorted, retrieving his spear. "Distance is for cowards who fear the blood mist. A true warrior smells his enemy's fear." Kael ignored the barb. He had no interest in tribal machismo. His focus was on the survival of his pack. He knew the Ironbone tribe was moving. Malakor's shadow was growing longer with every sunset, and the Stoneclaw's primitive technology would be their funeral shroud if he didn't intervene. He needed the longbow. Not the short, brittle hunting bows the children used for rabbits, but a true weapon of war. A bow with a draw weight that could punch through leather armor and stone glass plate. Mira approached them, her braided hair clinking with the small river stones that marked her status. She had been watching Kael with that same intense, observant gaze that made him feel like she was trying to read the soul behind his eyes. "The scouts say the sap is falling in the valley to the north," she said, her voice a calming contrast to Bruga's aggression. "You said that is the time for the wood to be cut." "It is," Kael replied. "The moisture is low, the wood won't warp as much when I season it by the fire." "I'll go with you," Mira said firmly. "The northern valley is close to the Ironbone borders. You'll need eyes that know the terrain, not just a mind that knows the wood." "And me," Cord shouted, running up to them. The boy was already wearing the primitive snowshoes Kael had designed a few weeks prior. He was the first to truly believe in Kael's magic, seeing the practicality in everything the boy who was old created. "I've sharpened the flint axes just like you showed me, Kael. They'll bite deep into the heartwood." Kael nodded. He appreciated Cord's enthusiasm and Mira's pragmatism. Together, the trio slipped out of the camp, leaving Bruga to his brute force training. As they moved into the dense forest, the atmosphere shifted. The Whispering Grove was a place of ancient growth, where the trees were so tall they seemed to hold up the heavy gray sky. Kael led them past the common oak and the brittle pine, his eyes searching for a very specific profile. In his old life as Elias, he had favored the English yew for its natural laminate properties, the sapwood that handled tension and the heartwood that handled compression. Here, in this prehistoric world, he had to find an equivalent. He had spent weeks observing the way different trees bent during summer storms. he had noticed a tree the tribe called the Sallowheart. It grew in the shadows of the granite cliffs, reaching for the light with a slow, agonizing persistence that resulted in incredibly tight growth rings. "There," Kael whispered, pointing to a stand of trees near a frozen creek. The Sallowhearts were slender but dense, their bark a pale, sickly yellow that belied the strength beneath. Kael approached the largest of them. He placed a hand on the bark, feeling the texture. He wasn't looking for a spirit, as Jara would. He was looking for straight grain and a lack of knots. He found a stave-length section that looked promising. "Korg, the axe. Mira, watch the ridge. The sound of the chopping will carry." As Korg began to work, his movements guided by Kael's technical corrections. "Angle the strike. Don't just hit it flat." Kael felt a familiar sensation. It was the echo, the phantom memory of the grizzly that had killed him. Sometimes in the silence of the woods, he could almost hear the heavy breathing of the beast. It wasn't just trauma, it felt like a spiritual tether. The bear represented the raw, chaotic power of this world, a power he intended to master through intellect. "You're doing it again," Mira said softly, standing a few feet away with her hand on her knife hilt. "You're looking through the world, not at it." "I'm looking at the future," Kael replied, not turning around. "If we get this right, Mira, the Stoneclaw won't have to run from the winter. We won't have to hide from Malachor. We will become the thing that others fear." Mira frowned. "Is that what you want, to be feared?" "I want us to exist," Kael said. It was the pragmatic truth. They spent hours harvesting the staves. Kael was meticulous, selecting only the finest pieces. He explained to a fascinated Korg how they would need to seal the ends with animal fat to prevent cracking, and how the wood would need to sit near the smoke vents of the huts for weeks. He spoke of draw weight, string follow, and mechanical advantage, terms that meant nothing to Korg, but felt like holy scripture because of the confidence in Kael's voice. Just as they were preparing to bundle the wood, the forest went deathly silent. The birds stopped their chatter, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Kael dropped to one knee, his hand instinctively reaching for the small stone knife at his belt. His modern hunting instincts screamed at him. "Down," he hissed to the others. Mira didn't hesitate, pulling Korg into the tall, dead grass. A moment later, a figure emerged from the tree line across the creek. It wasn't a beast. It was a man, but barely. He was dressed in the dark, heavy furs of the Iron Bone tribe, but his chest was marked with the ritualistic obsidian scars of Malachor's vanguard. The man was a scout, his face painted with the ash of burned bones. He didn't see them. He was focused on a trail, his movements fluid and predatory. But it wasn't the scout that froze Kael's blood. It was what the scout was carrying. In his hand was a broken piece of a stone claw spear, Bruga's spear, marked with his specific carving. The scout sniffed the air, a low growl escaping his throat. He looked toward the village's direction and smiled, a jagged, terrifying expression. "They're tracking Bruga," Korg whispered, his voice trembling. "No," Kael realized, his eyes narrowing as he watched the scout move with terrifying efficiency. "They're not tracking him. They're hurting him. They want him to lead them back to the main camp's weak point." Kael looked at the bundle of Sallowheart wood. It was useless now, just sticks. It would take weeks to become a weapon. He looked at the scout, then at his own small, weak hands. The gap between his knowledge and his current capability felt like a canyon. "We can't let him leave," Mira whispered, her hand trembling on her blade. "We can't kill him without a bow," Kael countered, his mind racing through 1,000 scenarios. "If we fail, he'll signal the others. We have to follow him. We have to find where their main force is hiding." As they began to shadow the scout through the darkening woods, Kael caught sight of something in the mud where the scout had been standing. It was a footprint, but far too large for a man. Beside it lay a tuft of thick, silver-gray fur. Kael's heart hammered against his ribs. The spiritual echo wasn't just in his head. The bear, or something that shared its soul, was working with the iron bone. The hunt had changed. Kael was no longer just a boy looking for wood. He was a ghost from another world, trying to prevent a massacre in this one. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the snow, Kael knew the bend in the wood was just the beginning. The real war was already at their gates. Chapter 14. Stringing Hope. The morning frost clung to the tall grass of the valley like a shroud of shattered glass. For Kael, the boy who carried the soul of a man named Elias, every breath was a plume of white mist that reminded him of the ticking clock. Winter was not just a season here, it was a predator, and it was closing in. Inside the communal longhouse of the Stoneclaw tribe, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the metallic tang of drying meat. Kael sat in his corner, his fingers raw and stained with a mixture of animal fat and resin. Before him lay a dozen failed attempts at a bowstring, hemp fibers that snapped under tension, braided rawhide that stretched like wet clay in the humidity, and vines that grew brittle as soon as they dried. "Still playing with your toys, little ghost?" The booming voice belonged to Bruga. The massive warrior loomed over Kael, his shadow extinguishing the small patch of sunlight the boy was working in. Bruga's heavy stone-tipped spear was leaned against his shoulder, a weapon that had fed the tribe for generations through sheer, exhausting effort. "It's not a toy, Bruga," Kael replied without looking up. His voice was flat, the tone of a man who had seen death and didn't have time for posturing. "A spear requires you to be within the reach of the beast's claws. This allows us to strike from the shadows." Bruga let out a bark of a laugh, attracting the attention of several other hunters. "A warrior who hides is a coward. If you cannot look the mammoth in the eye as you bleed it, you do not deserve its meat. Your stick has no heart, boy." Kael ignored him, his analytical mind already pivoting back to the problem at hand. He needed high tensile strength and minimal elasticity. In his previous life, he would have ordered a spool of Fast Flight or Dacron B-50. Here, he had to rely on the biology of the land. "Kael," a softer voice called. Mira stepped forward, her braided hair swaying. She carried a small bundle wrapped in broad leaves. "The hunters brought down a great elk near the river. I remembered what you said about the threads of the legs." Mira knelt beside him, ignoring the skeptical grunts of the passing warriors. She unwrapped the bundle to reveal several long, yellowish-white strips of sinew, freshly harvested from the elk's hind legs and spine. Kael's eyes sharpened. Sinew. It was the holy grail of primitive archery. The collagen fibers were incredibly strong, but they were a nightmare to process. "Thank you, Mira," Kael said, his stoic mask slipping just enough to show a flicker of genuine gratitude. This might be the one. Over the next several hours, Kael began the grueling process. He wasn't just Kael the boy, he was Elias the master hunter. He used a smooth stone to pound the dried sinew, breaking the stiff bundles into individual, hair-thin fibers. Korg, the young apprentice who had been watching from a distance with wide-eyed fascination, eventually crept closer. "Can I help?" Korg asked tentatively. "Sit," Kael commanded. "Watch how I shred these. They must be uniform. If one strand is thicker than the others, the string will twist and throw the shot." Korg followed instructions with a religious fervor. The youth represented the shift Kael was trying to instill, the move from raw brawn to calculated precision. Together they spent the day soaking the fibers in warm water, and then twisting them into a 3-ply cord, carefully staggering the joins so there were no weak points. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the valley, Gore, the chieftain, walked through the camp. He looked older today. The lines on his face were deep trenches of worry. He stopped to watch Kael, who was now coating the completed string in a mixture of beeswax and pine resin to waterproof it. "The Ironbone scouts had been seen near the Whispering Falls," Gore said quietly, his voice intended only for Kael's ears. "They are growing bold, Kael. Malachor is looking for an excuse to move his people into our hunting grounds before the snow falls. Does not work soon. I will have to send the boys Korg's age to the front lines with spears." Kael looked at Korg, who was happily polishing a cedar shaft. The thought of the boy being butchered by Malakor's obsidian-clad warriors sent a cold shiver through Kael that had nothing to do with the weather. "Give me until tomorrow morning, chieftain," Kael said. In the corner of the longhouse, Jara the shaman watched them through the smoke of her herbal fire. Her milky white eye seemed to track movements that weren't there. She saw the way Kael handled the sinew, not with the clumsy reverence of a child, but with the cold, practiced efficiency of a spirit who had done this 1,000 times before. She gripped her mammoth tusk staff, a prayer for protection whispering behind her teeth. That night, Kael didn't sleep. He spent the hours by the dying embers, tillering the bow, a beautiful piece of seasoned yew he had harvested months prior. He carefully notched the ends, and with a grunt of effort that strained his small frame, strung the bow for the first time with the new sinew string. The bow groaned, the wood bending into a perfect, lethal arc. The string hummed, a low, vibrant note that vibrated in Kael's very marrow. It was the sound of a predator waking up. At dawn, the tribe gathered near the training clearing. Bruga stood at the front, arms crossed over his massive chest, a smirk playing on his lips. He had set a target. A thick slab of bison hide draped over a wooden frame, 50 paces away. It was a distance no spear thrower could reliably hit with killing force. Kael stepped forward. He looked small, almost fragile, against the backdrop of the towering warriors. He held the bow, the sinew string glinting with a dull, waxy sheen. "One shot, little ghost," Bruga mocked. "If you miss, you go back to gathering berries with the children." Kael didn't respond. He entered a state of zanshin, the lingering mind. He felt the wind on his neck, noted the humidity in the air, and calculated the drop. He pulled an arrow from his belt, a straight shaft of cedar with a fire-hardened tip and fletching made from turkey feathers. He nocked the arrow. He drew the string back. The tension was immense. The sinew bit into his fingers, but the string didn't stretch. It held firm, storing the massive energy of the yew limbs. Kael's breathing slowed. The world narrowed down to the center of the bison hide. Thrum. The sound was unlike anything the Stoneclaw tribe had ever heard. It wasn't the heavy thud of a spear or the whistle of a stone. It was a sharp metallic crack of released power. The arrow was a blur. It crossed the 50 paces in a heartbeat. Thwack! The arrow didn't just hit the bison hide. It punched through the thick leather and the wooden frame behind it, burying itself halfway into the trunk of a tree several feet further back. Silence fell over the clearing. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Bruga walked over to the target, his face a mask of disbelief. He reached out and tugged on the arrow. It didn't budge. He looked back at Kael, the mockery gone, replaced by a flickering shadow of fear and respect. Gore stepped forward, his eyes bright with a sudden fierce hope. "With this, we don't just survive the winter, we hold the valley." Mira ran to Kael's side, her face beaming. "You did it, Kael. You really did it." Kael let out a long, slow breath, his muscles trembling from the adrenaline. He looked at his hands, the hands of a child, now holding the power to change history. He saw Korg looking at the bow as if it were a holy relic. But the celebration was short-lived. A panicked cry rose from the southern watchpost. A scout stumbled into the clearing, his shoulder bleeding, an obsidian-tipped arrow protruding from his calf. "The iron bone!" the scout gasped, collapsing to his knees. "They aren't just scouting. Malakor is leading a war party. They'll be at the river by sunset." Kael looked at his single bow, then at the horizon. He had the weapon, but he didn't have the army. Not yet. "Bruga," Kael said, his voice cutting through the rising panic. The warrior looked at him. "Forget the spears for today. Gather the strongest wood and every scrap of sinew we have. We have 12 hours to make the rest of the tribe as dangerous as I am." As the tribe scrambled into motion, Kael felt a cold gaze on his back. He turned to see Jara, pointing her staff at him. "You have brought a new fire to us, Kael," she whispered as she passed. "But fire burns the hand that holds it as often as it warms the hearth. I hope the spirit inside you knows how to put it out." Kael didn't answer. He looked at the bow in his hand, then out toward the approaching storm. He wasn't Elias the hunter anymore. He was Kael, the architect of a new world, and he would let the valley burn if it meant his pack survived. Chapter 15. Target Practice. The dawn broke over the Stoneclaw encampment, not with the usual cacophony of waking hunters, but with the rhythmic, repetitive thrum of tension and release. Kael stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath misting in the cool morning air. Before him lay 12 longbows, their limbs carved from seasoned ash and reinforced with layers of animal sinew. To any other member of the tribe, they were strange, skeletal things. To Kael, they were the first step toward an industrial revolution. "Hold your breath at the peak of the draw," Kael commanded, his voice flat and devoid of the childish pitch his 12-year-old body should possess. He was adjusting Cord's elbow, forcing the younger boy to lift his arm. "If you tremble, the arrow will feel it. The bow is an extension of your skeleton. If your bones are weak, the sting is weak." Cord nodded frantically, sweat dripping down his nose despite the chill. He pulled back the string, his small muscles quivering. Beside them, Mira watched with a mixture of awe and concern. She had seen Kael's toys take down a buck from a distance no spear could reach, but seeing a line of children holding these weapons felt different. It felt like the world was shifting beneath her feet. "They are young, Kael," Mira whispered, stepping closer. "In our tradition, a hunter does not hold a weapon of death until their blood is cooled. You are putting the power of a thunderclap in the hands of those who still play in the river." Kael didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the targets, bundles of tightly packed dried grass marked with charcoal circles. "The Ironbone tribe doesn't care about the age of the people they slaughter, Mira. Malakor's men are coming. When they do, they won't bring traditions. They will bring obsidian and malice. I am not teaching them to play. I am teaching them to survive." Suddenly the heavy brush at the edge of the clearing parted. Bruga emerged, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the children. He carried a heavy, stone-tipped spear, the weapon of a true warrior. He let out a booming laugh that made several of the trainees flinch, their arrows clattering to the dirt. "Look at this!" Bruga roared, gesturing to the bow in Cord's hand. "A stick and a string. Kael, you are a clever boy, but this is a coward's tool. A warrior proves his worth by the heat of the beast's breath on his face. He feels the resistance of the hide as the spear sinks in. This is throwing pebbles from a bush." Kael finally turned, his piercing, aged eyes meeting Bruga's fiery gaze. The contrast was stark. The mountain of a man, fueled by ancestral pride, and the small, wiry boy, fueled by cold, modern logic. "A spear requires you to be within 30 paces, Bruga. At 30 paces, a cave lion has already decided how you taste. At 100 paces, a cave lion is just a target." "Words, just words," Bruga spat. He pointed toward a thick-barked oak tree nearly 60 yards away. "If your little stinger can pierce that wood from here, I will stop calling it a toy. But if you fail, you stop wasting these children's time. They should be carrying rocks to build the barricades." Kael didn't hesitate. He picked up his signature longbow, a masterpiece of his own crafting, and notched an arrow tipped with a razor-sharp flint head. He didn't just pull the string. He flowed into the stance. To the tribe, it looked like magic. To Elias, the soul within, it was muscle memory from 1,000 hunts in the Bitterroot wilderness. He visualized the wind, the drop, and the density of the wood. Thrum, crack. The arrow was a blur. It didn't just hit the tree. It buried itself 4 inches deep into the heart of the trunk with a violent thud that echoed through the valley. The children gasped. Bruga froze, his jaw tightening as he stared at the vibrating fletching. "The spear is for the strong," Kael said, his voice cutting through the silence. The bow is for the smart. In my world, in the world we are building, the smart survive long after the strong have been buried. Bruga walked over to the tree, tugging at the arrow. It didn't budge. He looked back at Kael, his expression shifting from mockery to a grudging, terrifying respect. It bites deep, I give you that. For the next several hours, the training intensified. Kael taught them about the anchor point at the corner of the mouth, the importance of fletching alignment, and how to track a moving target by leading the shot. He was creating the first archery corps of the Stone Claw. Korg proved to be a natural, his small stature allowing him a stability that the more muscular boys lacked. By midday, the children were hitting the grass targets with 60% accuracy. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Gore, the chieftain, watched from the ridge above. Beside him stood Jara, the shaman. Her one good eye was fixed on Kael. He moves like an old predator in a cub's skin, Gore, she rasped, her voice like grinding stones. He does not teach them to hunt for food. He teaches them to hunt men. Is that a bad thing, shaman? Gore asked, his voice heavy with the weight of leadership. The Iron Bone are moving south. My scouts tell me the river is turning black with their waste. If this boy can give us a way to kill them before they reach our hearts, I will call it a blessing from the Great Spirit. A blessing can be a curse if it changes the soul of the people, Jara warned. The Stone Claw have always been hunters. He is turning us into soldiers. As the sun began to dip, Kael called for a final exercise. He had the children move into the dense undergrowth, instructing them to remain silent and wait for his signal. He wanted to test their ability to ambush. But the exercise was interrupted by a frantic cry from the perimeter. A scout burst into the clearing, his chest heaving, his fur tunic torn. "Gore! Kael!" the scout screamed. "The valley to the east. Smoke. Not a campfire. A forest fire. And the Iron Bone standards are raised on the ridge. They aren't just scouting anymore. Malachor is moving the entire war host." The air in the clearing turned cold. The children looked to Kael, their bows gripped tight in trembling hands. Kael looked at the line of young faces, then at the horizon, where a faint, dark smudge of smoke marred the sky. The time for target practice was over. The spirit of the bear that had killed him in his previous life felt closer than ever, manifest now in the impending brutality of Malachor's army. "Korg," Kael said, his voice low and steady. "Go to the storehouse. Bring every arrow we have finished. Mira, tell the women to move the elders to the high caves." He turned to Bruga, who was already reaching for his heaviest spear. "Bruga, you wanted to see if these could kill a beast? Tomorrow, you'll see if they can kill a king." Kael looked down at his own hands. They were small, scarred, and stained with wood sap. He wasn't Elias the hunter anymore. He was the architect of a new age, and he realized, with a chilling pragmatism, that the blood of the children he just trained would be the first ink used to write this new history. Chapter 16. The Healer's Knowledge. The air inside the healing hut was thick, a cloying mixture of wood smoke, old sweat, and the metallic, sickly sweet scent of a body fighting a losing battle. Kael stood in the shadows of the entrance, his eyes narrowed, filtering the scene through the lens of a man who had seen too many deaths and understood the mechanics of life far better than anyone in this age. On a bed of dry moss and matted furs lay Poda, the younger brother of Korg. The boy was barely 8 winters old, and his skin was a terrifying shade of translucent gray, slick with a cold, clammy sweat that didn't seem to cool him. Beside the boy, Jara, the tribal shaman, was hunched like a vulture. Her milky white eye caught the flickering light of the hearth as she shook a rattle made of dried jackal bladders and pebbles. She was chanting, a low, rhythmic drone that vibrated in the chest, but to Kael it was the sound of wasted time. He could see the boy's chest heaving, his respiration shallow and rapid. This wasn't a curse or a spiritual imbalance. It was a severe systemic infection, and the fever was cooking the child from the inside out. "The spirits of the marsh are heavy in his blood," Jara rasped, her voice cracking. She reached into a pouch and threw a handful of crushed dried herbs into the fire. A plume of purple smoke rose, making the others in the hut cough. Gor, the chieftain, stood by the doorway, his face etched with a helplessness that didn't sit well on his broad features. Behind him, Korg was trembling, his fists clenched so hard, his knuckles were white. He looked at Kael, his eyes pleading. He didn't know why he looked to a 12-year-old boy for hope, but Kael had already changed so much for him. Kael stepped forward, the crunch of the dry floor rushes drawing every eye to him. "The boy's blood isn't heavy with spirits, Jara," Kael said, his voice flat and clinical, cutting through the mysticism of the room. "If the heat does not leave him by the time the moon reaches its peak, his heart will stop." Bruga, who had been leaning against the support pillar, let out a harsh snort. "And what would a boy who spends his time bending sticks know of life spirits? Jara has guided this tribe since before your mother was born, Kael. Stand back." Bruga's hand went to the hilt of his stone knife, a defensive reflex for his traditions. But Gor held up a hand. The chieftain looked at Kael, remembering the way the boy had restructured their hunting patterns, and the efficiency of the atlatl he'd introduced. "You speak with the weight of a man, Kael," Gor observed. "Do you have a way to cool this fire?" Kael nodded slowly. "The Great Spirit provides medicine, not just in smoke and bone, but in the bark of the trees that drink from the cold water. I need the white-barked trees from the river's edge, the ones that bend but do not break." "The willow?" Mira asked, stepping from the shadows near the boy's head. She had been bathing Pota's forehead with cool water, though it did little. Hale turned to her, appreciating her quick mind. "Yes, the inner skin of the bark. It contains the essence of the cold stream." In his mind, Elias was already calculating the dosage of salicin. He knew that willow bark was the precursor to aspirin. It wouldn't cure a deep infection if it was bacterial, but it would drop the fever, reduce the inflammation, and give the boy's own immune system a fighting chance. Without it, the delirium would lead to seizures, and then death. Jara stood up, her staff clattering against the stones. "This is forbidden, to strick the skin of the living tree to feed a child. It is the way of the scavengers, not the stone claw." "The stone claw will be a tribe of ghosts if we do not evolve, Jara," Kael replied, not backing down. He looked at Korg. "Korg, go, take your knife. Bring me the inner bark, the soft pale layer of 3 young willows. Do not stop for anything." Korg didn't wait for Gor's permission. He vanished into the night. For the next hour, the hut was a pressure cooker of tension. Kael moved to the hearth, pushing Jara aside with a firm, respectful pressure that surprised the old woman. He began to boil water in a hollowed-out stone vessel, carefully selecting stones from the fire to drop into the water to keep it at a rolling simmer. When Korg returned, panting and scratched from the brush, Kael took the strips of bark. He shaved them into fine curls, explaining to a hovering Mira how the water must pull the spirit from the wood until it turned the color of weak tea. "Drink this," Kael commanded, as he lifted the boy's head. Pota moaned, his eyes rolling back. It was difficult to get the bitter liquid down him, but with Mira's help, they managed. Bruga watched with a mixture of contempt and growing curiosity. He wanted Kael to fail, so the world would make sense again, yet he wanted the boy to live. As the night deepened, the silence in the hut became absolute. Kael sat cross-legged, his eyes never leaving the boy, his internal clock counting the minutes. He knew the pharmacokinetics of the decoction would take time. An hour passed, then 2. Jara began a low hum, perhaps a prayer for the boy's soul or a curse for Kael's hubris. But then a change occurred. A bead of sweat, not the cold, clammy kind, but a genuine hot sweat, broke out on Pota's brow. His breathing, once a jagged rasp, began to lengthen and smooth out. Mira gasped, pressing her hand to the boy's chest. He's cooling. The fire is receding." Korg fell to his knees, sobbing with relief. Gore stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Kael's shoulder. The weight of it was more than physical. It was the weight of a chieftain's favor. Jara remained silent, her milky eye fixed on the discarded willow bark. She realized then that Kael wasn't just a boy with clever tools. He possessed a forbidden library of the world's secrets. He was a threat to her order, yet he had done what her spirits could not. Kael didn't celebrate. He was already thinking of the next step. If the Ironbone tribe was as close as the scouts suggested, they would need more than just hunters. They would need a medic. He looked at his small, calloused hands, the hands of a 12-year-old, and felt the immense burden of the future he was forced to build. Just as the tension in the room began to dissipate, the heavy hide flap of the hut was thrown open. A scout, bloodied and breathless, stumbled in, collapsing at Gore's feet. "Chieftain," the man wheezed, "the Ironbone, they didn't wait for the frost. They've crossed the Black Creek. They have monsters with them." Chapter 17. Bruga's Envy. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Obsidian Range, casting long, bloody shadows across the settlement of the Stoneclaw tribe. It was a time of unprecedented abundance. For the first time in generations, the drying racks were groaning under the weight of salted bison meat, and the smell of roasting fat hung thick and sweet in the air. At the center of the camp, Kael, the boy who carried the soul of a modern hunter named Elias, sat near the communal fire. He was meticulously carving a piece of ash wood, his movements precise and economical. Beside him, young Korg was trying to mimic his grip on a new prototype of a recurve bow. To anyone else, it was just wood and sinew. To Kael, it was the physics of potential energy, a concept the tribe called spirit trap. "The balance is off, Korg," Kael said, his voice quiet, but carrying the authority of a man twice his age. "If the limbs don't bend in unison, the arrow will fly like a wounded bird. Respect the wood, and it will give you its strength." Korg nodded vigorously, his eyes wide with hero worship. "I will, Kael. With this I hit the target from 40 paces today. The elders say it's impossible for a boy my size to throw a spear that far." "It's not a spear, and it's not just strength," Kael replied, looking into the fire. "It's a tool. It's an extension of your intent." A few yards away, the mood was far less celebratory. Bruga, a mountain of a man with skin like scarred leather, sat with the veteran hunters. He gripped his heavy stone-tipped spear so tightly his knuckles were white. Before him lay a massive elk, one that he had brought down today, but it had taken him 6 hours of tracking, and a dangerous melee that left a fresh gash on his thigh. Meanwhile, Kael's hunting party of adolescents had brought back 3 younger bulls, using those strange, hooked throwing sticks Kael called atlatls, without a single scratch on them. Bruga spat into the dirt. "Look at them," he growled, his voice a low rumble that silenced the nearby chatter. "Playing with sticks and strings like children. They do not hunt. They play tricks on the world." One of his companions, a man named Torn, nodded cautiously. "But Bruga, the meat, we haven't eaten this well since the Great Thaw. Gore is pleased." "Gore is blinded by a full belly," Bruga barked, standing up. His sudden movement drew the eyes of the entire camp. He was a head taller than most, a relic of the era where raw power was the only currency of survival. He marched toward Kael, his heavy footsteps thumping against the packed earth. Kael didn't look up until Bruga's shadow fell across his work. The boy's piercing eyes, far too old for his 12-year-old face, met the warrior's furious gaze without a hint of tremor. "Is there a problem, Bruga?" Kael asked. "The problem is you, little ghost," Bruga spat. He kicked Kael's half-finished bow, sending it skittering into the dust. "You bring things into this tribe that do not belong. A hunter faces his prey. He feels its breath. He earns the kill with his blood and the strength of his arm. You sit in the shadows and use magic to steal the life of beasts from a distance. It is cowardly. It is wrong." Korg stood up, trembling but defensive. "It's not magic, Bruga. It's better." Bruga backhanded the air in Kord's direction, though he didn't strike the boy. "Silence! You are being led into the dark by a demon in a child's skin. Look at his eyes. Do those look like the eyes of a boy?" At the edge of the circle, Jara, the shaman, emerged from her hut. Her vulture feather cloak rustled in the wind, and her single milky white eye seemed to catch the firelight in an unsettling way. She leaned on her mammoth-tusked staff, watching the confrontation with a calculated silence. She had long suspected Kael was not the boy he appeared to be, and Bruga's outburst was the catalyst she had been waiting for. "He speaks of dark magic," Jara's raspy voice cut through the tension. "He speaks of the spirits being cheated. A hunter's life is a trade, blood for blood. If the blood is taken too easily, the spirits grow hungry elsewhere." Gor, the chieftain, stepped forward from his longhouse, his heavy bearskin cloak draped over his weary shoulders. "Enough. Bruga, Kael has fed us. Jara, the spirits have not denied us the rain or the sun since the boy began his crafting. What is the true issue here?" "The issue is honor," Bruga shouted, gesturing to the hunters. "The young ones no longer look to the warriors for guidance. They look to him. They do not learn to be brave. They learn to be clever. When the Iron Bone tribe comes, and they will come, will we hide behind sticks, or will we be men?" Kael stood up slowly, brushing the dust from his furs. He felt the analytical mind of Elias, calculating the social dynamics. He knew he was disrupting the hierarchy. In his past life, technology was a tool. Here it was a revolution that threatened the very identity of the strong. "Survival isn't about how much you bleed, Bruga," Kael said calmly. "It's about whether your people are alive to see the next spring. If you want to use a stone spear because it makes you feel like a man, do so. But do not tell the mothers of this tribe that their sons must die in a buffalo's horns just so you can feel honorable." A collective gasp went through the tribe. No one spoke to Bruga that way. The warrior's face turned a deep, bruised purple. He lunged forward, grabbing Kael by the throat and lifting him off the ground. Mira screamed and tried to step in, but her father, Gor, held her back, his face a mask of conflict. "You think your words make you big?" Bruga hissed into Kael's face. "I could crush your neck before you could reach for one of your toys." He stared into Bruga's eyes with a cold, terrifying detachment. "And if you do," Kael choked out, "who will teach the tribe how to survive the winter when the bison are gone and the Iron Bone come with their obsidian armor? You? You can't even catch a rabbit without a day's sweat." Bruga roared and threw Kael to the ground. "I challenge you, not to a fight, that would be killing a flea. I challenge your magic. Tomorrow we hunt the great horn at the edge of the world, alone. I will take my spear, you take your sticks. Whoever brings back the head of the great horn is the true leader of the hunt. If I win, your tools are burned, and you are banished to the wastes." "And if I win?" Kael asked, coughing as he rubbed his throat. Bruga smiled cruelly. "If you win, I will kneel and call you master. But you won't win. The great horn is a spirit beast. Your thin sticks will snap against its hide like dry grass." Jara stepped forward, her staff clicking against a stone. "The spirits accept this challenge. It is the only way to see if the boy's power is a gift or a curse." Mira broke free from Gor and ran to Kael's side, helping him up. "Kael, no. The great horn is too dangerous. Even groups of 5 hunters don't go after it." Kael looked at Bruga, then at Jara, and finally at the gathered tribe. He saw the doubt in the eyes of the elders and the fear in the eyes of the youth. He knew that if he didn't prove his methods now, his vision for the stone claw would die before it truly began. He was a world-class hunter in his past life, but he was currently in a 12-year-old body against a prehistoric titan. "I accept," Kael said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence of the camp. As the tribe dispersed in a flurry of whispers, Kael retreated to his workspace. He wasn't scared. He was focused. He needed to build something more than an atlatl. He needed to bridge the gap between a boy's strength and a monster's hide. Deep in the woods, miles away, a scout from the Iron Bone tribe watched the glow of the stone claw fires. He wore obsidian-studded leather and held a mace stained with dried gore. He turned to his companion. The stone claw is divided. The boy with the flying spears is being tested. We must inform Malachor. The time to harvest is near. Back in the camp, Kael sat alone, the fire dying down. He looked at his hands, small, calloused, but steady. "All right, Bruga," he whispered to the knight. "Let's see if your honor can stand up to 3,000 years of ballistics." Chapter 18. The Salt Expedition. The wind howled through the jagged peaks of the Stoneclaw territory, a precursor to the biting winter that loomed just weeks away. Kael, known to his former life as Elias, stood atop a granite outcrop, his eyes scanning the horizon. In his previous life, a world of GPS and refrigerated logistics, salt was a triviality, a shaker on a diner table. Here, in the primitive cradle of a harsh new world, it was more valuable than gold. Without it, the massive stores of mammoth and elk meat the tribe had painstakingly gathered would rot within the moon's cycle, leaving the Stoneclaw to starve in the snows. "The air is changing," a voice said from behind him. Mira approached, her riverstone braids clinking softly. She had become his most trusted ally, the bridge between his modern mind and the tribe's ancient heart. "Gore is worried. The hunters bring back meat, but the flies are already thick. We cannot eat it all at once." Kael turned, his small, wiry frame a sharp contrast to the athletic Mira. "We won't have to. I told your father about the White Lake. If the maps I've reconstructed from the old scout stories are correct, the salt there will save us." Gore, the chieftain, had been hesitant. The White Lake lay on the edge of the Deadlands, a region whispered to be haunted by the spirits of those who died of thirst. But Kael's track record of innovation, the atlatl, the refined hide tanning, had earned him a seat at the council. The expedition party was small: Kael, Mira, the ever-eager Korg, and Bruga. Bruga remained a point of tension. The massive warrior carried a heavy stone-tipped spear and a deep-seated skepticism. To him, Kael was a runt who played with cowardly tools. "We waste time, boy," Bruga grumbled as they descended the rocky slope toward the lowland plains. "We should be hunting, not looking for white sand that makes the tongue sting." "Strength is useless if your belly is empty in the moon of cold," Kael replied without looking back. "Salt stops the invisible rot. It's not magic, Bruga, it's the way of the world." As they trekked, the lush green of the valley gave way to a desolate, cracked landscape. The heat here was different, dry and shimmering. Korg, carrying a prototype of Kael's longbow, looked around nervously. "The shaman Jara says the spirits here drink the blood of the living. Is that why it's so dry?" "The spirits of the sun and the earth are in a constant dance," Mira said, trying to soften Kael's clinical explanation with tribal lore. "Here, the sun has won for a time." Hours bled into a day of hard marching. Kael used the time to teach Korg how to read the terrain for signs of water, his modern survival training bleeding into his lessons. Suddenly, the horizon opened up. A vast, blindingly white expanse stretched before them. It looked like snow, but the heat told a different story. "The White Lake," Kael breathed. It was a dried-up endorheic basin, thick with crusty deposits of sodium chloride. Bruga stepped onto the white surface, his heavy boots crunching. He knelt, touched a finger to the crust, and tasted it. His face contorted. "It is foul. You brought us here for this poison?" "It is life, Bruga," Kael said, kneeling beside him and digging his knife into the crust. He pulled up a thick slab of crystalline salt. "We pack as much as we can carry. We rub this into the meat, and it will stay good until the thaw." They began the grueling work of harvesting. Kael showed them how to pick the cleanest layers. Even Bruga, despite his complaints, worked with the efficiency of 3 men, his massive muscles rippling as he filled heavy leather sacks. During a break, Mira sat by Kael. "You look at this place differently than we do. You don't see ghosts. You see pieces of a puzzle. The world is a machine, Mira, Kael said, a rare moment of vulnerability crossing his face. If you understand the parts, you can fix the whole. My old life, I lost it because I forgot that the machine can also crush you. He thought of the grizzly bear, the spiritual echo that still haunted his dreams. Here, he wasn't just surviving, he was building an armor of knowledge. Their progress was interrupted by Korg's sharp whistle. He was standing on a small salt dune, looking toward the north. Smoke, he whispered. Kael pulled out a primitive but effective spyglass he'd fashioned from a polished crystal, one of his latest experiments. He peered through it. In the distance, a group of figures moved with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. They weren't dressed in the furs of the stone claw. They wore dark obsidian plates and carried heavy maces. Iron bone, Bruga spat, his hand tightening on his spear. Malikor's dogs. The Ironbone tribe was the shadow over the valley, known for their cruelty and their king Malikor. Seeing them so close to the salt flats meant the territory was no longer neutral. They haven't seen us yet, Kael whispered, his mind racing. We have the salt, but if they find our trail, they'll follow us back to the village. We need to move, now. They scrambled to load the remaining bags. As they prepared to leave, Kael noticed something half buried in a deeper salt pit near the center of the lake. He walked over and kicked the salt away. His blood ran cold. It was a totem, a pole made of human femurs, topped with a skull encased in black obsidian. It was a territorial marker, fresh and glistening with a dark, tacky resin. This isn't a dead land, Kael realized, his voice trembling slightly. Malikor already knows the value of salt. Just as they turned to flee, a low, guttural horn sounded across the flats. A scout from the Ironbone tribe stood on a ridge barely 300 yards away, pointing his obsidian-tipped spear directly at them. The hunt was on. Chapter 19. The Trial of the Forest. The morning mist in the jagged peaks was not a blanket, but a predator. It clung to the damp bark of the ancient cedar trees, obscuring the precipices that lined the stone-claw territory. For Kael, the boy who carried the soul of a modern hunter named Elias, the cold was a familiar adversary. He stood at the center of the clearing, his small, wiry frame a sharp contrast to the towering presence of Bruga. The tribe had gathered in a heavy silence, the kind that preceded a ritual or a death. Bruga, the tribe's strongest warrior, held a crude stone knife in his calloused palm. The blade was obsidian dark, chipped into a jagged edge that looked as though it could tear more than it could cut. You speak of traps, Kael. You speak of the bow and the long-distance kill, Bruga boomed, his voice echoing off the valley walls. You teach the young ones to hide in the shadows and strike from afar. But a warrior of the stone claw does not fear the breath of his prey. To lead, to be one of us, you must prove you can take a life when the beast's eyes are reflecting your own. Mira stood near the chieftain's hut, her fingers twisting the furs of her tunic. She looked at her father, Gore, but the chieftain remained silent, his face a mask of weary pragmatism. He needed Kael's innovations for the tribe to survive the coming winter, but he could not ignore the laws of the hunt that had governed their people for generations. Jara, the shaman, leaned on her mammoth-tusk staff, her one good eye fixed on Kael. She saw the echo around him, the shimmering, restless spirit of a man who did not belong to this age. Bruga threw the stone knife into the dirt at Kael's feet. The great horned goat of the North Ridge. Bring its heart back before the sun touches the western spine. Alone. No bow, no traps, just the knife and your own 2 hands. Kael reached down and picked up the blade. It was poorly balanced, heavy in the hilt and dull near the tip. To Elias, who had used precision-engineered steel, this was like trying to hunt with a broken brick. But he didn't complain. He looked Bruga in the eye, his gaze cold and analytical. The bow is a tool for the tribe's survival, Kael said quietly. But if you need to see me bleed to believe in it, then watch closely." Without another word, he turned and vanished into the tree line. Cord, Kael's young apprentice, stepped forward, as if to follow, but a heavy hand from Bruga stopped him. "This is the trial, boy. He returns a man, or he does not return at all." As Kael climbed, the forest changed. The lush floor of the valley gave way to shale and stunted pines. His lungs burned. This 12-year-old body was getting stronger, but it was still a child's vessel. Elias's mind, however, was already mapping the terrain. He wasn't looking for the goat. He was looking for the goat's necessity: water, salt, and escape routes. He tracked the wind, feeling the subtle shifts against the fine hairs on his arms. The mountain goat, the great horn, was a legendary beast among the Stoneclaw, known for its ability to traverse near vertical cliffs. To catch it with a stone knife was a fool's errand. Unless, of course, the hunter knew more about the goat than the goat knew about itself. Hours passed. Kael found the tracks near a mineral lick, hoofprints deep and fresh. The animal was large, likely over 300 pounds. He crouched, his heartbeat slowing as he entered the hunter's trance, a state of hyperfocus Elias had perfected in the Alaskan wilderness. He didn't follow the tracks directly. He moved laterally, staying downwind, climbing higher than the trail. He knew the goat would feel safe looking down, but rarely would it expect a predator to drop from the crags above. His hands were raw from the climb, the obsidian knife tucked into his belt. He saw it then, a magnificent creature with wool as white as the lingering snow and horns that curved like obsidian scimitars. It was perched on a narrow ledge, surveying the valley below. It was a dance with gravity. Every pebble he dislodged was a potential death sentence. He moved only when the wind gusted, masking the sound of his movement. His mind raced with calculations, the angle of the slope, the density of the shale, the reach of his small arms. When he was 20 feet above the beast, he stopped. His muscles were screaming. He gripped the stone knife. This wasn't about strength. It was about the carotid artery. He waited for the goat to turn its head toward the sun. In that moment of blindness, Kael leaped. He didn't scream. He was a silent shadow falling from the sky. He landed on the beast's back, his weight forcing it toward the edge. The goat let out a shrill, piercing bleat, bucking with terrifying power. Kael's world became a blur of white fur and gray stone. He felt a rib crack as the goat slammed him against the rock face, but he didn't let go. He drove the stone knife into the side of the neck, feeling the resistance of the thick hide. The obsidian blade was dull, so he used his body weight to saw, to tear. Blood, hot and metallic, sprayed across his face. The struggle was primal. For a moment, Elias's memory of the grizzly bear that killed him flashed before his eyes, the smell of death, the sound of crushing bone. But this time, he wasn't the victim. He twisted the blade, his small fingers locking around the goat's horn to stabilize himself. With a final desperate heave, the animal collapsed, its legs folding. They both slid toward the precipice, stopping only inches from a 300-foot drop. Kael lay there, gasping for air, covered in the blood of the great horn. He had done it. He looked at the knife. It had snapped in half during the struggle. He laughed, a dry, rasping sound. The old ways were brutal, but they were a reminder of why he worked so hard to change them. As he began the arduous task of butchering the kill to carry it back, his analytical eyes caught something out of place. On a nearby tree, the bark had been stripped away in a specific pattern, a spiral of 3 lines crossed by a jagged bone shard. It wasn't a Stoneclaw mark. It was the sigil of the Iron Bone tribe, the cannibals Malachor led. They weren't just in the valley. They were scouting the peaks. Kael's blood ran colder than the mountain air. The trial wasn't over. It was just the beginning of a war. Chapter 20. Patience of the Predator. The air at the summit of the jagged spires was thin enough to make a man's lungs feel like they were being scraped with flint. For Elias, Now Kael, this sensation was a familiar ghost of his past life, a reminder of the high-altitude hunts in the Rockies. But for the Stoneclaw tribe, it was a place of spirits and danger, where only the strongest dared to tread. Kael knelt in the frost-covered scree, his small hands moving with a precision that unsettled the older men watching him. Beside him, Korg was mimicking his movements, carefully weaving brittle mountain grass and lichen over a framework of saplings. "The scent is the key, Korg," Kael whispered, his voice steady despite the biting wind. "The great horned goat doesn't just see the mountain, it smells the intent of anything on it. We aren't building a hole, we're building a piece of the mountain that happens to be empty." Korg nodded fervently, his eyes wide with the devotion of a true believer. "And the stakes, Kael? You said the angle matters more than the sharpness?" "Exactly. If they are vertical, the goat might scramble out. At a 45-degree angle pointing inward, its own weight becomes its cage. We don't need to kill it instantly. We just need to remove its ability to flee." "Cowardice!" The roar shattered the morning silence. Bruga stood 10 paces away, his massive frame silhouetted against the rising sun. He gripped his heavy stone-tipped spear so tightly his knuckles were the color of the surrounding limestone. Behind him, a few of the traditional hunters shifted uncomfortably, torn between their loyalty to the strongest warrior and the rumbling of their empty stomachs. "We are the Stoneclaw," Bruga bellowed, stepping forward. Each footfall sent a cascade of pebbles down the slope. "We take our meat with blood on our hands and sweat on our brows. You dig holes like a frightened marmot, Kael. You shame the ancestors with this trickery." Mira stepped between them, her hand resting on the hilt of the bone knife at her hip. "The ancestors also died of hunger during the last great frost, Bruga. Kael's trickery brought us 3 elk last week, while your spear returned dry. Gore has sanctioned this hunt. Stand down." Bruga's face contorted. He looked at Mira, then at the undersized boy who didn't even flinch at his shouting. Kael's eyes, those haunting ancient eyes, remained fixed on the trap. To Bruga, it wasn't just about the hunt. It was about the very foundation of his worth. If a boy with no muscles could provide more than a warrior with a mountain of scars, what was Bruga? "Strength is the only law of the wild," Bruga growled, though he didn't advance further. "When the Iron Bone tribe comes, and they will come, your pits will not save you. Only the spear will." "You're right about one thing, Bruga," Kael said, finally standing up and dusting the frost from his knees. "Strength is law, but you think strength is only in the arm. I say it's in the environment. I'm not fighting the goat. I'm making the mountain fight it for me." Kael signaled for everyone to retreat to the observation ridge. They moved with practiced stealth, a skill Kael had been drilling into the youth of the tribe. They lay flat against the cold stone, draped in mottled gray furs that blended perfectly with the crags. Minutes turned into an hour. The sun climbed higher, turning the peaks into shards of gold. Then, a movement caught Kael's eye. On the opposite ridge, a great horn emerged. It was a beast of legend, nearly 6 feet at the shoulder, with horns that curved like massive scimitars. It moved with a gravity-defying grace, leaping across chasms that would make a human's heart stop. Bruga tensed, his hand twitching toward his spear. This was the prize he had hunted for 3 seasons. To him, the beast was a god to be wrestled. To Kael, it was a caloric calculation. As the goat approached the scent-masked path Kael had laid out, baited with a specific mineral salt found in the lower caves, the tension on the ridge was palpable. The beast stopped. It sniffed the air. It looked directly toward their hiding spot. "Don't blink," Kael thought, slowing his heart rate. "I am the stone. I am the wind." The goat took a step, then another. It reached the patch of mountain Korg had woven. The sound was a sharp crack, followed by a heavy thud. The great horn let out a shrill, panicked bleat as the ground vanished beneath its front hooves. It tumbled forward, its massive weight carrying it into the pit. The angled stakes didn't pierce its heart, but they wedged between its limbs and ribs, pinning it firmly in the narrow, tapered bottom of the hole. "Now!" Kael commanded. Before Bruga could even process what had happened, Korg and the other apprentices were out of cover, carrying heavy stone-weighted nets. They threw them over the pit, securing the beast's head and lethal horns. Kael walked to the edge of the pit. The goat was magnificent, its eyes rolling in terror. He felt a pang of the old hunter's respect, the same respect he felt for the grizzly that had once taken his life. But that Elias was dead. Kael was a provider now. It's unharmed," Mira whispered, coming to his side. "We can transport it alive to the lower pens." "Fresh meat for the winter, and a chance to see if we can breed them," Kael said. "A hunter kills once, a master of the wild harvests forever." Bruga approached the pit, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He looked at the trapped god of the mountain, then at Kael's small, steady hands. There was no glory in this, he thought. No song would be sung of a hole in the dirt. And yet as he looked at the sheer size of the animal, he knew he could never have brought it down alone without risking his life or the lives of his men. "It is a coward's victory," Bruga muttered, but his voice lacked its previous venom. He turned to his men. "Get the carry poles. We haul this weight back to the village." As the tribe worked to secure the animal for the descent, Jara, the shaman, appeared from the shadows of a nearby overhang. She had watched the entire event in silence. She approached Kael, her milky white eye reflecting the cold sun. "The spirits of the mountain are confused, Kael," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. "You did not ask for their permission. You simply took." "The spirits didn't fill our bellies last winter, Jara," Kael replied softly, "so the others wouldn't hear." "Perhaps. But be careful, boy. When you stop being a part of the hunt and start being the architect of it, you stop being a predator. You become a god, and the world has a way of breaking gods." She leaned on her mammoth tusk staff, her gaze shifting to the far horizon, toward the smoke rising from the valley of the Iron Bone. "Malachor does not use pits. He uses fire and obsidian. He is coming, Kael, and your patience will be tested by a hunger far greater than a goat's." Kael watched her walk away, his mind already spinning with the next set of problems. He looked at his hands, small, calloused, but capable of rewriting the laws of this world. He wasn't a god. He was a survivor. And survivors didn't care about honor. They cared about the next morning. Suddenly, a scout burst from the tree line below, sprinting up the rocky path. His chest was heaving, and his face was pale with terror. "Chieftain! Kael!" the scout screamed. "The Iron Bone! They've crossed the Black River! They aren't raiding! They're migrating! The whole tribe is moving!" Kael's blood ran cold. A raid was a problem. A migration was an invasion. He looked back at the pit, then at Bruga. The era of traps was about to meet the era of war. Chapter 21. The First Frost. The air in the valley didn't just turn cold, it turned sharp. When Elias, now Kael, opened his eyes inside the communal longhouse, his breath blossomed into a thick, white mist that lingered in the dim morning light. Beside him, the embers of the central hearth were struggling, choked by a sudden, unnatural dampness that had seeped through the thatch. He sat up, his joints aching, with a familiarity he hadn't felt since his previous life. In the Yukon, this kind of sudden drop meant one thing: a killer frost. Here, in this primitive world, it meant a death sentence for the unprepared. Kael pushed aside his heavy bison-hide blanket and stepped onto the packed earth floor. It was hard as stone. Outside, the usual morning cacophony of the Stone Claw tribe, the rhythmic grinding of grain, the shouts of children, the barking of dogs, was replaced by an eerie, muffled silence. He stepped out of the longhouse and stopped. The world had been transformed overnight. A thick glaze of rime ice coated every branch, every stone, and every hide-covered hut. The vibrant autumn gold of the valley had been erased, replaced by a monochromatic, skeletal silver. Kael, A voice broke the silence. It was Korg, his young apprentice. The boy was shivering violently, his thin tunic offering no protection against the sub-zero snap. He was clutching a clay jar that had shattered, its contents, a solid block of ice, spilling onto the frozen mud. The river, Kael. It's gone silent. Korg's teeth chattered so hard, Kael feared they might crack. Kael didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the riverbed that sustained the stone claw. Usually the rushing water provided a constant low-frequency hum to the camp. Now, there was nothing. He began to run. His light, snowshoe-ready boots, a prototype he'd been working on, crunching over the frozen grass. At the riverbank, he found Gore and Bruga. The chieftain looked older than he ever had, his bearskin cloak weighed down by frost. Bruga was shirtless, his massive chest heaving as he swung a stone maul against the surface of the water. Clang! The sound was like a hammer hitting an anvil. The water hadn't just frozen, it had solidified into a sheet of black ice, nearly 6 inches thick. "It is a curse," a raspy voice drifted from the fog behind them. Jara, the shaman, approached, her vulture feather cloak rattling like dry bones. Her milky eye fixed on Kael. "The spirits of the mountain are angry. We have taken too much, changed too much. The frost comes to reclaim what is theirs." "It's not a curse, Jara. It's a weather front," Kael muttered under his breath, though he knew the term would mean nothing to them. He turned to Gore. "If the river is frozen solid this early, the fish will be trapped beneath the ice, and our water skins will burst if we don't drain them. But more importantly, our current shelters won't hold the heat. We'll lose the elders and the infants by the 3rd night." Gore looked at the frozen expanse. "The first frost usually comes after the harvest moon, Kael. This is weeks early. The grain isn't dry. The meat is still hanging in the smoke huts." "Then we move fast," Kael said, his voice cutting through the panic. "Bruga, stop hitting the ice. You're wasting energy. We need to build a Dakota fire hole, underground heating. Korg, get the youths. We need to gather every dry piece of wood before the frost melts and turns everything to slush. Mira." Mira emerged from the fog, her eyes wide, but her hands steady. She was already carrying a bundle of dry tinder. "I've already told the women to start doubling the linings on the inner tents, Kael. But the elders are listening to Jara. They think the new ways brought this cold." Kael felt the familiar weight of leadership, and the familiar resentment of the traditionalists. Somewhere up there, the spiritual echo of the bear that had killed him in his past life seemed to roar in the wind. He could almost feel its presence, a cold malice driving the winter down early. "Let them talk," Kael said to Mira. "While they pray, we survive. We need to create a thermal mass. We're going to use the stones from the river to hold the heat inside the longhouses." For the next several hours, Kael became a whirlwind of activity. He instructed the tribe on how to coat the exterior of their huts with a mixture of frozen mud and straw, creating a primitive form of insulation. He showed them how to dig ventilation shafts that would allow fires to burn hot without smoking everyone out. Bruga, initially skeptical, found himself tasked with the heaviest labor, hauling massive river boulders into the center of the living quarters. These stones would be heated in a central fire, and then radiate warmth throughout the night. "This is woman's work, digging holes in the dirt," Bruga grunted, though he didn't stop. "It's survival, Bruga," Kael replied, not looking up from his work. "Dead warriors don't hold the line. If you want to fight the Iron Bone tribe in the spring, you have to breathe through the winter." Bruga paused, looking at Kael's small, frost-bitten hands working tirelessly. A flicker of respect passed through the warrior's eyes, quickly hidden by a scowl. "The boy speaks like a general, even when he's playing in the mud." As the sun began to set, a pale, heatless disk slipping behind the peaks, the temperature plummeted further. The air grew so thin it pained the lungs. The tribe huddles together. Inside the modified longhouse, the heat from the stones began to permeate the air. It was the first time in hours the children stopped crying. However, the peace was short-lived. a scout barely able to walk, stumbled into the camp from the northern pass. His skin was blue, and his fingers were black with frostbite. "Malachor," the scout gasped, collapsing into Gore's arms. "The iron bone. They aren't hiding from the frost. They are using it." Kael stepped forward, his heart sinking. "What do you mean?" "They have fire sleds," the scout whispered before losing consciousness. "They are moving across the frozen marsh. They're coming for our stores. They know we're trapped by the ice." Jara shrieked, pointing a skeletal finger at the northern sky. "The Demon King walks with the winter. He is the frost." Kael looked at the frozen river, then at his handcrafted longbow hanging on the wall. He had prepared the tribe for the cold, but he hadn't prepared them for a war in the middle of a blizzard. The modern hunter in him calculated the odds. They were low, very low. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl echoed from the woods surrounding the camp. It wasn't a wolf. It was deeper, more ancient. Kael's pulse quickened. He knew that sound. It was the sound of the ghost bear, the spirit of his death, marking its territory in the New World's winter. "The frost was just the beginning," Kael whispered, tightening his grip on his bow. Chapter 22. Trapped in the Ravine. The morning sun was a pale, sickly disk, hung behind a veil of gray frost. In the high altitudes of the jagged pass, the air was thin enough to burn the lungs with every breath. Bruga, the mountain of a man who served as the Stoneclaw's strongest warrior, didn't care for the cold. To him, the biting wind was merely a whetstone against which he sharpened his resolve. He led a party of 6 hunters, their eyes fixed on the massive cloven tracks of a great horned elk. "Keep your eyes on the ridge," Bruga grunted, his voice like grinding stones. "The beast is tired. It bleeds. We take it before the sun crosses the peak." Behind him, the hunters nodded, though their faces were pale. They were deep in the Spirit's Teeth, a section of the mountains known for its unstable slopes and sudden, violent shifts in the earth. Bruga, driven by a desperate need to prove that raw strength still outweighed Kael's cowardly traps and bows, pushed them harder than usual. Suddenly, the world went silent. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the terrifying vacuum of sound that precedes a catastrophe. A sharp, rhythmic crack echoed from the heights above, a sound like the snapping of a god's rib. Bruga looked up, his eyes widening. A shelf of snow, thick as a forest and heavy as a mountain, had broken free. "Run!" he roared, but the word was swallowed by a thunderous groan that shook the very foundations of the earth. The white wall descended with impossible speed. It wasn't just snow. It was a churning tide of ice, rock, and uprooted trees. One of the hunters was swept away instantly, his scream cut short as he was pulled into the white abyss. Bruga threw himself toward a rocky overhang, but the force of the wind preceding the avalanche knocked him off his feet. He felt the world spin, the cold crushing the air from his chest, and then darkness. Back at the Stoneclaw encampment, the atmosphere was heavy with the smell of roasting meat and damp fur. Kael was sitting by the communal fire, meticulously fletching a new batch of arrows using the feathers of a mountain hawk. His mind was miles away, calculating the caloric requirements for the tribe to survive the coming deep winter. He was interrupted by a frantic cry. Korg, the young apprentice who had been scouting the lower slopes, stumbled into the clearing, his face smeared with soot and tears. "The mountain!" Korg gasped, collapsing before Chieftain Gore. "The teeth have bitten! Bruga, the party, they are gone!" The camp erupted into chaos. Gore stood, his heavy bearskin cloak sliding from his shoulders. Jara, the shaman, stepped forward, her vulture feathers rustling. She raised her bone staff, her milky eye fixed on the distant clouded peaks. "The spirits have claimed their due," she declared, her voice cold and final. "The mountain has spoken. To seek those who are taken is to invite the mountain's hunger into our very camp. We must mourn, and we must stay." Gore's face was a mask of grief. "Bruga was our shield," he whispered. If he is gone, who will stand against the iron bone? Kael stood up, his small, wiry frame a sharp contrast to the trembling warriors around him. They aren't gone, Kael said, his voice cutting through the panic with clinical precision. An avalanche doesn't always kill. If they found an air pocket, they have hours, maybe a day. Jara turned on him, her expression one of sneering suspicion. You speak of the mountain as if it were a puzzle, boy. It is a god. It has swallowed them. Your strange tools cannot dig through the will of the spirits. Kael didn't look at her. He looked at Mira, who was already gathering her gear. I'm not going to argue with spirits, Jara, Kael said, grabbing his longbow and a bundle of long, sharpened saplings he had prepared weeks ago. I'm going to find my people. Mira stepped to his side, her river stone braids clinking. I'm with him, father, she told Gore. If there is a chance, we cannot abandon them. Gore looked between the stoic Kael and the defiant Mira. After a long silence, he nodded. Go. But if the moon rises and you have not found them, you return. We cannot lose the future to save the past. The trek to the ravine was a grueling test of endurance. Kael led the way, wearing a pair of primitive snowshoes, latticed wood and hide, that he had fashioned. While Mira and Korg struggled through the knee-deep drifts, Kael glided on the surface, his analytical eyes scanning the terrain for tells. He looked for the deposition zone, where the snow would have piled the highest. When they reached the site, the devastation was breathtaking. The valley floor was buried under 20 feet of packed, jagged ice. Where do we even start? Korg asked, his voice trembling, as he looked at the vast white wasteland. Physics, Kael muttered. He began to thrust his long saplings into the snow at regular intervals. We probe, look for anything that isn't solid rock or soft pack. If we hit something springy, it's a body or a cloak. For hours they worked in the fading light. The cold began to seep into Kael's bones, a familiar, haunting sensation that reminded him of the day the grizzly had ended his first life. He shook the thought away. He wouldn't let the cold win this time. Suddenly, his probe hit something. It felt firm, but had a slight give. Here, he shouted. They began to dig with their hands and stone scrapers. After 3 feet of packed snow, they found a hand. Blue-tinged and calloused. It was Bruga's. They cleared the snow around his head first. The giant warrior was unconscious, his face battered, but he was breathing. He was pinned beneath a large fallen pine that had inadvertently created a small triangular air pocket. As Mira began to rub Bruga's hands to restore circulation, a shadow fell over them. Kael looked up to the ridge of the ravine. 3 figures stood there, clad in black obsidian armor that glinted like dried blood in the twilight. They carried maces decorated with human teeth. Ironbone scouts, Korg whispered, his face turning ashen. The enemies didn't attack immediately. They watched with the cold, detached curiosity of predators observing prey in a trap. One of them, a scout with a jagged scar across his throat, raised a horn to his lips. They're calling the rest, Kael realized. He looked at Bruga, who was still half buried and unable to move, and then at the steep, unstable walls of the ravine. They were trapped in a bowl of ice, with the most ruthless killers in the valley, closing in. But then, a sound came from the darkness further down the ravine, a low, guttural vibration that wasn't human. It was a roar Kael knew in his very soul. It was the sound of the Great Bear, the spiritual echo of his own death, marking its territory. The Ironbone scouts froze. The mountain wasn't finished with any of them yet. Chapter 23. Walking on Snow. The sky over the Stoneclaw Valley had turned the color of a bruised plum before the first flakes fell. Within 6 hours, the world was gone, replaced by a suffocating, waist-deep shroud of white. In the modern world Elias had come from, this would be a scenic winter. Here, in the primitive reality of Kael, it was a death sentence. The Great White had arrived 3 weeks early, catching the tribe with their stores half empty, and 3 of their best trackers, including Korg's older brother, missing since the morning scout. Kael stood at the mouth of the main cave, his breath blooming in the frigid air. Beside him, Gore leaned heavily on his staff, his bearskin cloak dusted with frost. "The spirits are hungry this year," Gore whispered, his voice cracking. "The snow is too soft. To walk is to sink. To sink is to freeze. We cannot reach them, Kael." A few yards away, Bruga was proving the chieftain's point. The massive warrior, fueled by a mixture of desperation and pride, roared as he tried to leap into the drift toward the tree line. He took 2 steps, his massive frame plunging hip-deep into the powder. He thrashed, his stone-tipped spear uselessly churning the snow, until he was stuck, gasping, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "It is the weight of his sins," Jara hissed from the shadows of the cave, her bone charms clinking. "The earth refuses to hold those who defy the old ways. We must wait for the crust to freeze, or the spirits will take the lost ones as a tithe." Kael didn't look at Jara. He was looking at a dead hare brought in earlier that day. He noted the wide, fur-padded feet of the creature. Surface area, distribution of mass. It was a basic lesson from his life as a hunter, one that Bruga's raw muscle couldn't overcome. "The earth isn't refusing him," Kael said, his voice level and cold. "He's just too small for his own weight." "What did you say, runt?" Bruga spat, struggling back toward the cave entrance as Mira and 2 others pulled him out with a leather rope. "I can make us walk on top of the snow," Kael said, turning to Gore, "but I need every scrap of supple willow and all the rawhide cord we have, now." Gore looked at Kael's eyes, the eyes of an old man in a boy's body, and nodded. "Do as he says." The next 3 hours were a whirlwind of activity. Inside the cave, huddled by the central fire, Kael directed a production line. He showed Mira how to steam the willow branches until they were pliable, bending them into elongated teardrop shapes. He taught Korg how to weave the rawhide into a tight, interlocking lattice across the frame. "It looks like a spider's web for a giant," Korg remarked, his fingers flying despite the cold. He was terrified for his brother, but Kael's calm was infectious. "It's a tool, Korg," Kael explained, tightening a knot with his teeth. "The snow is like a trap. If you put all your weight on one point, it snaps and swallows you. If you spread that weight across a wider space, the snow can hold you. It's not magic, it's balance." Jara paced the perimeter of their workspace, her milky eye fixed on the strange wooden frames. "You shaped the wood to mock the feet of the animals," she muttered. "You think you are wiser than the Great Bear?" Kael looked up, his gaze piercing. "The Great Bear died because I was smarter than him, Jara. My people are freezing out there. If your spirits want to save them, tell them to start weaving." By the time the sun began to dip, Kael had finished 6 pairs. He stepped to the edge of the drift, the snowshoes lashed firmly to his fur boots. The tribe gathered at the cave mouth, a wall of skeptical, frightened faces. Bruga watched with a sneer, certain the boy would sink and embarrass himself. Kael took a breath, centered his gravity, and stepped out. He didn't sink. The willow frame groaned slightly, the rawhide lattice biting into the powder, but he stayed on the surface. He took another step, then another, moving with a strange, high-kneed gait. He wasn't just walking, he was gliding over the very obstacle that had paralyzed the strongest man in the tribe. "Impossible," Bruga whispered, his jaw dropping. Mira was the next to step out, laughing in pure, crystalline relief as she realized she didn't fall. "It feels like flying, Kael." "Keep your formation," Kael commanded, his survivalist instincts taking over. "Korg, Mira, Bruga, put them on. We have an hour of light left. If we don't find them before the temperature drops further, the snowshoes won't matter." Reluctantly, Bruga strapped the cowardly tools to his feet. Within minutes, the rescue team was moving through the forest. The silence of the snow-covered woods was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic shuck-shuck of the frames. They moved at a pace that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. Kael led the way, his analytical mind tracking the subtle depressions in the snow where the lost hunters had struggled. He found the spot where the trail ended abruptly, near a steep ravine. "Down there," Korg cried, pointing. At the bottom of the 20-foot drop, 3 figures were huddled together under a rocky overhang, half buried. They were shivering violently, the early stages of hypothermia setting in. But as Kael prepared to lead the descent, he stopped. His eyes narrowed, spotting something that didn't belong in a natural winter landscape. Embedded in a tree trunk, just above the trapped hunters, was an arrow. It wasn't stone-tipped. It was made of jagged, black obsidian, polished to a lethal sheen, the signature of the Iron Bone tribe. "Kael, why are we stopping?" Mira asked, her hand on his shoulder. "We aren't alone," Kael said, reaching for the longbow on his back. "They didn't just fall. They were hunted." Chapter 24. The Frozen Hand. The blizzard howled with the voice of a dying god, a relentless, bone-chilling roar that stripped the warmth from anything it touched. In the heart of the Serpent's Pass, the Stoneclaw tribe's winter camp was buried under 6 feet of fresh powder. Inside the great cave, the air was thick with the scent of wet fur and the acrid smoke of low-burning fires. Gore sat by the hearth, his bearskin cloak pulled tight, his eyes fixed on the entrance, where the white veil of the storm blotted out the world. Beside him, Mira was pacing, her hands twisting the river stones in her braids. "He should have been back by midday," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the gale. "The frost bison don't run in this weather. Bruga is a fool for trying." Across the fire, Jara leaned on her mammoth tusk staff, her one milky eye reflecting the dying embers. "It is not the bison he hunts, child," the shaman croaked. "It is his own shadow. He sees the boy crafting tools that make the hunt easy, and he feels his own strength becoming a ghost. He went out to prove that the old ways are the only ways." Kael sat in the corner, his back against the cold stone wall. He wasn't pacing, he wasn't praying. He was meticulously checking the tension on his longbow, his mind a whirlwind of calculations. He knew exactly what was happening to a body in this temperature. Vasoconstriction would be setting in. The extremities, the hands, the feet, would be the first to go. If Bruga was still out there, he wasn't just cold, he was dying. "Korg," Kael said, his voice flat and commanding. The young apprentice looked up from where he was sharpening a bone knife. "Bring the frames, the ones we laced with the gut string last week." "The snowwalkers?" Korg asked, scrambling to his feet. "But Kael, the chieftain said no one leaves the cave until the winds die." Kael stood up, his wiry frame looking deceptive against the backdrop of the massive warriors huddled in the cave. To them, he was a small boy. To himself, he was Elias, a man who had survived the Alaskan wilderness before they were even a thought in history. "Gore," Kael called out, ignoring the protocols. "Bruga is the strongest spear you have. If you let him freeze to prove a point about tradition, you lose the Ironbone War before it starts. I am going out." Gore looked at the boy. He saw the intense, piercing eyes that Jara claimed belonged to an ancient spirit. He sighed, the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. "Go. But if the White Death takes you too, Kael, this tribe ends with you." Kael and Korg stepped out into the white hell. The wind hit them like a physical blow, a wall of ice that sought every gap in their furs. Korg stumbled immediately, his legs sinking waist-deep into a drift. But Kael didn't sink. He stepped onto the surface of the snow, the wide, oval wooden frames of his snowshoes distributing his weight. He looked like a water strider on a pond. Korg followed suit, his eyes widening as he realized he could walk where a man should drown. They tracked the path Bruga had taken. It wasn't hard. The big man had carved a trench through the snow with his sheer bulk. A wasteful expenditure of energy that Elias found offensive. After an hour of trekking, the wind shifted, revealing a glimpse of the ravine below. There, at the base of a jagged rock outcropping, was a shape. It was Bruga. He was half submerged in a drift, his heavy stone-tipped spear abandoned a few paces away. His mountain-of-a-man physique was curled into a shivering ball. When Kael reached him, he saw the warrior's hand, the frozen hand, clutched around a piece of jagged ice. It was pale, the color of a dead fish, and stiff as stone. "Leave me," Bruga managed to wheeze, his jaw locked with the onset of hypothermia. "The spirits have chosen." "The spirits didn't choose anything, Bruga. Physics did." He knelt down, reaching into his pack for a small clay pot filled with rendered animal fat mixed with herbs, a crude but effective thermal paste. "Korg, build the wind wall, now!" Korg jumped into action, using a flat wooden board Kael had designed to stack blocks of hardened snow into a semicircle. It was a basic igloo-style windbreak. Inside the small sanctuary, the temperature jumped 10 degrees almost instantly. Kael pulled out a small bundle of dry cedar bark and his firestone, a piece of flint, and a high-carbon iron scrap he'd recovered from an old meteor site. With a few sharp strikes, a shower of sparks ignited the tinder. Bruga watched with glazed eyes. To him, the boy was summoning fire from his fingertips in the middle of a graveyard of ice. Kael didn't stop there. He used a length of braided leather rope and a simple notched branch to create a mechanical advantage, a primitive lever system, to hoist Bruga's massive weight out of the deep drift and into the sheltered area. As the warmth of the fire began to bite back the frost, Bruga's shivering became violent. Kael forced him to drink melted snow warmed in a skin. "Why?" Bruga rasped, looking at his blackened fingers. "I called your tools cowardice. I said you were not a man." Kael looked him dead in the eye, the soul of the modern survivalist staring through the eyes of the 12-year-old boy. A pack doesn't throw away its strongest wolf just because he's too stubborn to see the trap. You're not a warrior right now, Bruga. You're an asset. And I don't like losing my assets. For the first time, the pride in Bruga's eyes flickered and died, replaced by a profound, terrifying realization. He had survived because of the very things he despised. He reached out with his good hand and touched the edge of Kael's snowshoe. "The snow, it did not swallow you. It only swallows those who fight it," Kael replied. "I don't fight the world, Bruga. I use it." They waited out the worst of the peak in the small snow shelter. Kael spent the hours teaching Korg how to maintain the fire with minimal fuel, while Bruga watched in a silent, contemplative daze. The hierarchy of the Stoneclaw was shifting in that small, dark space. The man of stone was being reformed by the boy of fire. When the winds finally calmed to a rhythmic hum, the trio began the slow trek back. As they approached the Cave of Echoes, the entire tribe was gathered at the entrance. Mira was the first to run forward, her face a mask of relief. She stopped short when she saw Bruga, the man who once mocked Kael, leaning heavily on the boy's shoulder, his frozen hand tucked safely into Kael's own thermal furs. Bruga stood tall as they entered the cave, though his legs shook. He looked at Gore, then at the gathered hunters who had always followed his lead. He took his stone-tipped spear, the symbol of his status, and thrust it into the ground at Kael's feet. "The boy is not a demon," Bruga announced, his voice echoing off the cavern walls, "and he is not a coward. He walks upon the white death as if it were solid earth. From this day, my spear belongs to his mind." Jara stepped forward, her vulture feathers rustling. She looked at the spear, then at Kael. Her expression wasn't one of triumph, but of deepening suspicion. She saw the change in Bruga, and it frightened her more than the storm ever could. As the tribe celebrated the return of their champion, Kael walked to the cave entrance and looked out toward the distant peaks of the Ironbone territory. The sky was clearing, revealing a blood-red sunset. In the distance, a thin plume of black smoke rose from the horizon, too dark and too steady to be a natural fire. "They're coming," Kael whispered to himself, "and they aren't waiting for the spring." And that is where we'll leave it for now. If you made it this far, you're already part of the journey. This is Ikonic Worx Media, where stories live and stay with you. If you enjoyed this, Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment, and step back in for the next chapter. Until then, stay sharp, and I'll see you in the next story.